Why did the Roman Empire, that invincible machine, collapse? How could a civilization that dominated the world vanish? Welcome to Collapse, where giants fall. Today, we will delve into one of the greatest enigmas of history, from invincible legions to fallen emperors, from bloody plots to barbarian invasions. The fall of Rome is a story of power, betrayal, and chaos. We will trace back the fate of Rome, explore the hidden cracks of an empire in crisis, and discover how one of the greatest civilizations in history ended up collapsing. But before embarking on a new adventure, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you, and have a good journey. Imagine a small village on the banks of the Tiber, in the center of the Italian peninsula, surrounded by hills and blessed with a mild climate. It was here that, according to legend, the descendants of Aeneas, a Trojan hero fleeing the destruction of his homeland, settled. From this lineage, tradition tells us, two twins were born, Romulus and Remus. Abandoned and then rescued by a she-wolf, they founded the city of Rome. Romulus, driven by a fratricidal quarrel, killed his brother Remus and gave his name to the future capital of a vast empire. These stories, passed down from generation to generation, are part of Rome's legendary heritage. They are certainly full of symbols, the nurturing she-wolf, the heroic destiny, but the historical reality is less spectacular. In reality, Rome was born from a gradual grouping of rural communities settled on the hills of Latium. The so-called royal period roughly extends from the 8th to the 6th century before Christ. During these centuries, Rome is influenced by the Etruscans, a powerful people from northern Italy who introduced new skills, urban planning, certain religious rites, engineering techniques. Around 509, before Christ, tradition reports the expulsion of the last Etruscan king, Tarquin the Proud. The Romans then established a regime they called res publica, meaning the public thing, intended to prevent any monarchical drift. At the head of this emerging republic is the Senate, a consultative and aristocratic body, and annual magistracies, like the consuls, responsible for implementing decisions and leading the army. This system aims to be collegial. Concentrating too much power in the hands of one man is avoided. However, political weight remains primarily with the patricians, these great families owning lands and wealth. Quickly, the young republic is shaken by internal tensions. The plebeians, that is, the majority of the people who do not belong to the patrician elite, demand political rights and fair access to conquered lands. The early centuries of the Republic are marked by this patrician-plebeian struggle, punctuated by concessions, hard-won. The tribune of the plebs, notably, allows plebeian representatives to defend their fellow citizens against the abuses of magistrates. Laws, like the Licinio-Sextian laws of the 4th century before Christ, open the consulate to plebeians. Thus, gradually, the republican system expands political participation, even if the great clans maintain their grip. Within this republican framework, Rome embarks on military expansion. Initially around the city itself, it gradually subjugates neighboring peoples. The Samnite Wars, between the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ, ensure its dominance over central and southern Italy. Thanks to a skillful network of alliances, Rome gradually integrates Italic peoples, sometimes granting them special status or partial citizenship. This policy of association, unique for its time, solidifies Rome's influence over the peninsula. Then comes the crucial period of the Punic Wars, between the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, against Carthage, a wealthy rival city-state located in North Africa. Three major conflicts opposed the two powers for control of the Western Mediterranean. The most famous episode is undoubtedly Hannibal's crossing of the Alps with his war elephants during the Second Punic War. Finally, Rome, thanks to its tenacity, its remarkable capacity for mobilization, and the genius of some generals like Scipio Africanus, managed to defeat Carthage. This victory established the Roman Republic as the main military force in the Western Mediterranean. It conquered Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and later the Iberian Peninsula. Having conquered the West, Rome turned its gaze to the East. It attacked the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from the empire of Alexander the Great. Gradually, Greece and Asia Minor, corresponding to present-day Turkey, fell under Roman influence. This momentum transformed Rome. From an Italian city, it became a Mediterranean power, controlling more and more distant provinces. War spoils, tributes paid by the defeated, and abundant slave labor proliferated. The great Roman families became wealthier, built sumptuous villas, and consolidated their power. Meanwhile, the small farmers, often mobilized for long military campaigns, struggled to maintain their lands. They sometimes sold them to aristocrats, who formed vast agricultural estates. These inequalities fueled social tensions. In response to these growing problems, some figures attempted agrarian reforms to redistribute land and relieve the poor plebeians. The Gracchus brothers in the 2nd century before Christ are the best known. But the opposition from the Senate and wealthy elites was fierce. A climate of political instability ensued. Rome, although at the height of its territorial power, was shaken by internal conflicts that foreshadowed the crises to come. The early centuries of the Republic had forged a solid institution, but the expansion of conquests upset the balance of power. In the 1st century before Christ, Rome was torn apart by several civil wars. General Marius, supported by the urban plebeians, opposed Sulla, champion of the senatorial aristocracy. Sulla marched on Rome, established a dictatorship, and eliminated his opponents. Later, Julius Caesar, another ambitious general, confronted Pompey, who defended senatorial legitimacy. Caesar prevailed and was appointed dictator for life. His brutal death in 44 before Christ, the victim of a senatorial conspiracy, plunged Rome into civil war once again. This period also saw the emergence of coalitions of generals, called triumvirates. The first united Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. The second, Octavian, Lepidus, and Mark Antony. Over the course of battles, Octavian, nephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar, eliminated his rivals. After the decisive victory over Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 before Christ, Octavian became the strongman of Rome. In 27 before Christ, he took the title of Augustus and inaugurated a new regime, the Principate. The Principate did not officially abolish republican institutions, but it partly stripped them of their real power. The emperor held tribunician power, meant to protect the plebeians, and proconsular imperium, authority over the army. Augustus presented himself as the one who restored peace and tradition after the civil wars. He undertook significant administrative reforms, the creation of new posts, reorganization of the army to professionalize it, and stabilization of borders. He focused on spreading the idea of a moral renewal, encouraged the imperial cult, and relied on talented writers to shape an idealized image of his governance. In reality, Rome transitioned into a de facto monarchical system, supported by the loyalty of the army and the charisma of the imperial figure. For 2 centuries, the Roman Empire experienced relative stability, especially when succession occurred in an orderly manner. After Augustus, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, with Tiberius Caligula Claudius Nero, continued, with varying degrees of success, this system. Then came the Flavians, with Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, and finally, the Antonines. The imperial territory then stretches from Great Britain to Egypt, from the Pillars of Hercules to the edges of Syria. This period is often referred to as the Pax Romana, meaning Roman peace. A form of relative calm reigns within the borders, even though the army remains permanently mobilized to secure the limes and repel incursions from external tribes. The provinces are organized into two main categories: senatorial provinces, more pacified and controlled by the Senate, and imperial provinces, often exposed to threats, placed under the direct authority of the emperor. The tax system is strengthened. The state raises taxes in money, sometimes in kind, to finance the army and the bureaucracy. Governors administer the provinces, ensuring order is maintained, taxes are collected, and justice is delivered. The army becomes professionalized with long-term enlistment and regular pay. Once demobilized, veterans receive land and contribute to Romanize the provinces where they settle. Economically, this era is flourishing. Roman roads, renowned for their reliability, connect the different regions of the empire, facilitating the trade of goods: wheat from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, spices from the East. The grand infrastructure projects, aqueducts, amphitheaters, baths, demonstrate the state's desire to invest in public projects, often to assert its legitimacy. On the cultural level, Romanization is taking place. The Latin language becomes the administrative reference in the West, while Greek remains important in the East, and cities acquire Roman-style buildings, such as forums, temples, and basilicas. Gradually, a sense of belonging to the empire is built, even though local identities remain strong. At the heart of this prosperity, currency plays an essential role. The Romans mainly issue three types of coins: the aureus in gold, the denarius in silver, and for daily circulation, bronze coins such as the sesterce or the aes. The silver denarius becomes the pillar of imperial trade. Reliable, its weight and silver content remain relatively stable during the first centuries of the empire, inspiring confidence in traders. Provincials become accustomed to using Roman currency, accepted throughout the empire, greatly facilitating exchanges and payment of troops. Thanks to this monetary solidity, the state can also finance major public works and pay officials and legionaries. Emperors, eager to show their generosity, sometimes distribute coins bearing the image of their reign during festivals or ceremonies. This imperial image, struck on precious metal, then circulates across the Mediterranean basin, contributing to the power's propaganda. However, some signs show that this balance is not infallible. Nero, who ruled between 54 to 68 Anno Domini, practices the first notable reduction of the silver content of the denarius, a way to mint more coins from the same amount of precious metal. Although controlled, this measure indicates that it becomes costly to pay the army and cover public expenses. Later, other emperors such as Vespasian continue this process on a small scale. For now, the economy is dynamic enough to absorb this without too much damage. But these slight devaluations foreshadow more serious monetary drifts in the following century. During the 2nd century of our era, the Roman Empire seems to reach its peak under the governance of several esteemed emperors, grouped under what is called the Antonine dynasty. Among them are Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Their reign is often considered a golden age of imperial Rome, characterized by internal stability, and apparent economic prosperity. Trajan, for example, undertakes measured but strategic military campaigns, notably in Dacia, present-day Romania, thus enriching the empire with new territories and valuable resources. Hadrian, more concerned with stabilizing borders than conquering, focuses on consolidating defenses. The famous Hadrian's Wall, built in the north of present-day England, illustrates this desire to secure the empire's boundaries. Thanks to these thoughtful policies, the budget balance is generally maintained. The income from the provinces and the flourishing trade cover the state's expenditures, whether it is the maintenance of the legions, major works, or paying the soldiers' wages. The gold and silver flowing into the Roman coffers maintain confidence in the currency, particularly in the silver denarius, the backbone of transactions. At the same time, a slow process of integration of the provinces continues. The idea that each inhabitant of the empire could eventually be recognized as Roman is gaining ground, even though the Edict of Caracalla, which will officially grant citizenship to all free men of the empire, will not occur until 212. For the moment, there is already a desire for cultural and legal unification. Cities adopt Roman institutions. The Latin language progresses in the West, while Greek retains great importance in the East. This dynamic makes the empire more cohesive, at least on the surface. The death of Commodus in 192, Anno Domini, marks a turning point. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, breaks with the image of the good Antonine emperors. His assassination opens a period of turmoil and rivalries. Several claimants vie for the imperial purple, each relying on the support of one or more legions. It is ultimately Septimius Severus who triumphs in 193, giving birth to a new dynasty, the Severans. Septimius Severus, reigning between 193 to 11, consolidates his authority by generously rewarding the soldiers who helped him seize power. The legions become increasingly powerful because their loyalty can make or break an emperor. To maintain their loyalty, the emperor must increase salaries, offer privileges, and sometimes turn a blind eye to certain abuses. These largesses are costly. The state finds itself under financial pressure, drawing from the treasury accumulated under the Antonines. His successors, notably Caracalla and Elagabalus, follow this logic of constantly maintaining the army with money. Caracalla, to finance his projects and pay the soldiers, does not hesitate to mint coins in large quantities and reduce the silver content in the denarii. This practice of devaluation, already observed under some previous emperors, accelerates and gradually arouses the distrust of the business world and the population. At the same time, the army becomes more politicized. Any victorious general at the helm of his legions can proclaim himself emperor, opening the door to new civil wars. The Severans, despite their desire to restore imperial authority, do not completely succeed in curbing this militarization of Roman political life. Clear signs of instability appear, heralding the deeper crises of the 3rd century. Behind these dynastic jolts, Roman society experiences significant transformations. The Edict of Caracalla, promulgated in 212 Anno Domini, constitutes a major step. It grants citizenship to all free men of the empire, regardless of their birthplace or ethnic origin. This act, initially perceived as a form of imperial generosity, also has fiscal motivations. Indeed, the new citizens become liable for certain taxes that only Roman citizens had to pay until then. The tax burden continues to grow. Maintaining an ever-demanding army, financing new architectural projects, or compensating for the lavish expenses of the imperial court requires a sustained flow of money. As gold and silver reserves dwindle, the state must be crafty to meet its payments, either by increasing fiscal pressure or by lowering the quality of the minted coins. This increase in taxation affects the entire society. Even the rich landowners feel threatened. Merchants risk bankruptcy. Small peasants crushed by tax and debt sometimes become indebted to the powerful. In the rural economy, the concentration of land accelerates. Large estates belong to elites often close to power. Struggling small owners end up selling or renting their plots, becoming colony, that is, tenants halfway between freedom and servitude. This system, called colonate, strengthens. It ensures stable labor for landowners and minimum protection for peasants, but it reduces social mobility and increases inequalities. Furthermore, we are witnessing the beginning of an economic slowdown. The first signs of inflation, linked to currency degradation, are appearing. Merchants and craftsmen are sometimes reluctant to accept some devalued coins. Precious metals are becoming scarce as mining operations in Spain and Dacia begin to wane, while wars at the borders sometimes disrupt trade routes. This slight erosion of Roman prosperity is not yet catastrophic at the beginning of the 3rd century, but it lays the foundations for a more pronounced monetary crisis. Finally, trust in imperial authority is gradually cracking. The reforms, often carried out in urgency, do not always address the structural causes of the problem. The state finds itself adopting short-term policies, preferring to immediately satisfy the army and certain pressure groups rather than developing a coherent long-term vision. While in the time of the Antonines the empire was still relatively stable, the end of the dynasty and the transition to the Severins highlight that good leaders alone are not enough to maintain such a vast and costly edifice. In 235 Anno Domini, the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander abruptly ends the Severan dynasty and opens an era of great political instability. This period, which historians will later call the military anarchy, is characterized by a rapid succession of emperors, often military professionals, proclaimed by their troops on the battlefield or in garrison camps. The loyalty of the army becomes the #1 criterion for accessing power. Anyone who controls the legions can claim the imperial title, but keeping it proves to be much more difficult. Each contender, to ensure the loyalty of his soldiers, engages in a real salary bidding war. Bonuses, currency distributions, promises of promotions. The goal is to win over the officers and discourage mutinies. But this frantic race for military rewards weighs heavily on the state finances. The coffers empty faster than they can be filled, especially as the empire undergoes numerous military shocks. Civil wars between rivals, barbarian raids at the borders, local rebellions. To compensate, monetary emissions are multiplied, often by reducing the amount of precious metal in each coin. The result, the intrinsic value of the currency drops, leading to inflation and widespread distrust. Meanwhile, insecurity spreads across the empire. In the countryside, plundering or the passage of armies, both friendly and hostile, leads to a decrease in agricultural production. In the cities, the fear of unrest and the shortage of resources prompts some inhabitants to flee to less exposed regions. It is the beginning of impoverishment, a progressive economic decline whose consequences will be felt over several decades. At the heart of the malaise lies a problem that, although purely technical at the outset, will take on gigantic proportions: monetary devaluation. the emperors of the 3rd century, faced with colossal financial needs, seek to issue a large number of coins to pay salaries, bribe barbarian tribes, or fund the bureaucracy. For this, they reduce the silver content in the denarius by adding metals of lesser value, such as copper or lead. The silver content of the currency, previously relatively stable, rapidly collapses. This alteration affects the entire economy. The coin loses its purchasing power because merchants quickly understand it contains less precious metal. Confidence in the currency decreases, fueling an inflationary spiral. Prices rise, making it difficult to purchase basic necessities like grain or oil. The popular classes, already fragile, are the first victims of this sudden increase in prices. To halt this downward spiral, some emperors try to create new currencies. Thus emerges the Antoninianus, theoretically with a higher silver content. But very quickly, this new coin also undergoes successive devaluations. Artisans, merchants, and even large landowners end up hoarding or saving the old pure silver coins, thereby reducing the circulation of sound money. The consequences are dramatic for the state. To pay its official suppliers, for example, those who provide the legions with wheat, it requires more and more coins as their real value has dropped. Entrepreneurs, on their side, no longer see the point of supplying goods to a state that pays them with a depreciated currency. Tax collection also becomes more difficult. Taxpayers, aware of the low value of the official currency, attempt to evade their duty through fraud or corruption. In response, the authorities increase taxation, gradually imposing contributions in kind, which heightens dissatisfaction and encourages tax exile or open rebellion in some regions. As if internal rivalries were not enough, the empire's borders are under strong pressure. To the west and north, Germanic peoples such as the Franks, the Alemanni, or the Goths take advantage of Roman weakness to carry out raids, sometimes devastating, in Gaul or along the Danube. To the east, the Sassanid Empire in Persia is a growing power and attacks the eastern provinces, sometimes seizing great cities. To repel these threats, the empire must raise more troops, reinforce fortifications along the limes, and maintain a complex logistics system. However, the army is already a considerable financial drain, especially in a context of monetary devaluation. Soldiers constantly demand pay adjustments to compensate for inflation. The emperors, in their desire to keep the army on their side, try to follow suit, further exhausting reserves. The situation complicates as some military chiefs, governing distant provinces, declare their independence. The most striking example is the Gallic Empire, founded by General Postumus in 260 Anno Domini, which includes several western provinces, Gaul, Britain, Hispania, until 274. Deprived of these regions, the Central Roman power loses not only human resources, but also significant fiscal income. This fragmentation further weakens the empire, already plagued by the military anarchy. To this already bleak picture are added several demographic catastrophes. Around the middle of the 3rd century, the empire faces a devastating epidemic known as the Plague of Cyprian between 249-262 Anno Domini. Even if the term plague often refers to any severe infectious disease in ancient sources, it is clear that this epidemic causes devastation. In many regions, mortality is high, affecting soldiers and civilians alike. This massacre mechanically reduces the empire's ability to defend itself. Fewer peasants are available to work the land. Agricultural production falls, and shortages are felt. The lack of workforce is accompanied by violent requisitions to feed the troops. Once again, this vicious cycle encourages the abandonment of certain rural areas deemed too exposed or overtaxed. Entire villages relocate, seeking to escape fiscal pressure or barbarian raids. In this context, localized famines appear. When the empire can no longer ensure a safe supply of foodstuffs, cities depend on sometimes failing local agriculture. Inflation particularly affects basic food products. The price of wheat, for example, can soar from one region to another. Inequalities deepen further as the wealthier manage to stockpile or buy on the black market, while the less fortunate do not have this option. This climate of food insecurity and recurrent diseases accelerates the fragmentation of the empire. Many inhabitants flee urban centers to seek refuge in more protected areas or to join self-sufficient rural communities. Large estates begin to behave almost like microstates, with their own militias and their own survival logistics. While threats accumulate, the imperial power tries to maintain a solid administration. At this time, the Roman Empire already counts a wide range of officials: procurators, prefects, tax collectors, palace agents. Theoretically, this administrative network aims to ensure order, collect taxes, and manage the requisitions needed for the army. But in practice, the monetary crisis and the absence of stable central authority encourage corruption and nepotism. Government officials, seeing the value of the currency plummet, seek to enrich themselves by accepting bribes or embezzling the funds they are supposed to collect. Some tax farmers exploit the situation to extract more from taxpayers, hoping to offset the rampant inflation. In return, the population, already suffocated by taxes, revolts or supports usurpers who promise fair reforms and a reduction of burdens. For the imperial authority, this loss of trust is disastrous. When the people no longer believe in the value of the official currency or in the integrity of its representatives, governing becomes difficult. The army itself becomes a hotbed of corruption. Officers and soldiers are tempted to demand sums under the table, to turn a blind eye to certain irregularities, or to directly plunder the provinces. As emperors succeed one another and piecemeal reforms struggle to stop the spiral, the feeling of injustice becomes widespread. It is in this climate that figures like Diocletian will soon appear, ready to take radical measures to restore order. But before this resurgence, the empire goes through a real quagmire. Divided, impoverished, and threatened from all sides, it is close to disintegration. The 3rd century, often summarized by the expression military anarchy, is much more than a series of conflicts between claimants. It is the moment when the Roman system, once so solid, wavers in its monetary, economic, and social foundations. In the middle of the 3rd century, the imperial succession has become a dangerous game. Generals vie for the throne, and the empire seems to crumble. Through bloody struggles, a military leader named Diocletian emerges in 284, after defeating or sidetracking his rivals. By this success, he temporarily ends the military anarchy that shook Rome for nearly 50 years. From the outset, Diocletian understands that he must restore the dignity of the imperial office, widely undermined by the self-proclaimed lightning emperors and their quick overthrow. He therefore strengthens the imperial majesty by introducing a more rigid court ceremonial, inspired by Eastern traditions. The emperor is no longer a simple princeps, the first among citizens, inherited from the Augustan tradition. He becomes a dominus, a quasi-sacred lord. Imperial audiences become rarer, the sovereign shows himself less accessible, surrounded by close guards and strict etiquette. This decorum aims to establish a symbolic distance between the emperor and the people in order to restore respectful fear and obedience. But Diocletian also knows that authority alone will not be enough to stabilize such a vast empire. One of his most famous measures is the establishment of the Tetrarchy. Rather than ruling alone, he shares power with 3 other men, an Augustus and a Caesar for the eastern part, an Augustus and a Caesar for the western part. He himself becomes the Augustus of the east, taking his associate Maximian as Augustus of the west. 2 Caesars, appointed by the Augusti, are responsible for assisting them and taking their place. The objective of this unprecedented organization is twofold. On the one hand, to better manage threats at the borders by placing a sovereign or his representative close to the conflict zones, Rhineland, Danube, East. On the other hand, to ensure an orderly transition at the time of succession by clearly designating the heir in advance. Diocletian thus hopes to break the infernal cycle of conspiracies and civil wars that have torn the empire apart for decades. Although ambitious, this system shows some effectiveness in the beginning, contributing to contain, if not eliminate, the risks of violent divisions. To establish this new regime, Diocletian also undertakes deep administrative reforms. Aware that the empire is too large to be supervised by a single hierarchy, he increases the number of provinces and groups them into dioceses. Each diocese, under the authority of a vicar, comprises several provinces, now of more modest size. This administrative fragmentation aims to tighten the meshes of state control, prevent a single governor from controlling too large a province, and thus a potential force of opposition. The immediate consequence is the rise of bureaucracy. More provinces mean more governors, more officials, a more complex system, but potentially more efficient, at least on paper. The goal is to better monitor tax collections and quickly suppress local revolts. Administrative positions proliferate, from praetorian prefects to simple scribes, including army officers and various levels of taxation. However, this administrative expansion also has its share of drawbacks. The system becomes costly to maintain, and the multiplication of positions can encourage corruption. Controls are indeed tighter, but embezzlement can occur at smaller levels, which are difficult to detect from the top. Therefore, the empire needs to collect more taxes to operate this apparatus, which increases the tax burden on the populations. Aware of the persistent fragility of the currency, Diocletian attempts to circumvent the problem by demanding a portion of taxes in kind: wheat, wine, oil, livestock, resources that no longer directly depend on the value of a degraded coin. This approach has an advantage. The army, thus supplied, does not rely solely on currency for sustenance, but it also has a significant impact on the monetized economy, which shrinks in some regions where the logic of barter or direct levy gradually supplants traditional commerce. One of Diocletian's priorities is to restore confidence in the Roman currency. Since the beginning of the 3rd century, issues of silver coins have experienced a drastic qualitative decline. Diocletian therefore undertakes to create new gold and silver coins, theoretically more stable, to replace the old depreciated currency. The intention is clear: to re-establish a solid standard that would once again inspire confidence in merchants and soldiers. However, minting higher quality coins is not enough if prices continue to soar. Thus, in 301 Anno Domini, Diocletian promulgates the edict on maximum prices. This text attempts to set a ceiling on the sale prices of various goods as well as wages, in the hope of curbing inflation. Historians have found fragments of this edict, which lists, article by article, rates for wheat, meat, oil, even the cost of travel or labor. In practice, the edict on maximum prices clashes with the reality of the market. Merchants are reluctant to adhere to imposed prices, often lower than what demand would allow them to earn. A black market quickly develops, allowing those who can to sell or buy at higher prices. Authorities attempt to crack down, but repression remains difficult and only fuels tensions. Some craftsmen or peasants prefer to hide their production to sell it outside official control, while others even flee regions that are too monitored. The relative failure of the edict on maximum prices demonstrates that administrative regulation, however well-intentioned, cannot alone correct the deep imbalances of an economy in crisis. At Diocletian's voluntary abdication in 305, new power struggles ensue. The tetrarchic system, although ingenious, struggles to survive without its architect, and several emperors vie for control of the empire. Ultimately, another extraordinary figure emerges, Constantine, who becomes the sole emperor in 324 after defeating his rivals. Constantine marks history with his religious policy. According to tradition, he converts to Christianity after a miraculous vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. In 313, he signs the Edict of Milan with Licinius, which proclaims tolerance of Christianity throughout the empire. This act makes Christianity an important ally, granting Constantine a new spiritual legitimacy. The Church, which was until then persecuted or tolerated according to the whims of emperors, gradually becomes a respected institution and a conduit of imperial authority. On a geopolitical level, Constantine initiates a decisive movement by founding a new Rome at Byzantium, renamed Constantinople in his honor. This city, located on the Bosphorus, enjoys an exceptional strategic position at the crossroads of trade routes between Europe and Asia, and close to the rich agricultural regions of Asia Minor and Egypt. This choice reflects a gradual transfer of the empire's center of gravity towards the east, more prosperous and less exposed to Germanic invasions. The emperor is also renowned for a lasting monetary reform. He introduced the solidus of gold, a high-quality coin whose gold purity was rigorously maintained at a stable level, quickly becoming the international reference for important transactions. The solidus offered monetary stability that had been sorely lacking for over a century. Its success was such that the Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to use it for many centuries. Thanks to this relative stability, the crisis slowed down a little. The imperial power, now centered in Constantinople, could better manage tax collection and the defense of the eastern borders. However, the bureaucratic heaviness inherited from Diocletian did not disappear. It was still necessary to fund the imperial budget, pay innumerable officials, and finance the army and civil administration. Social disparities persisted, and large landowners retained vast agricultural domains, while peasants often depended on their protection. Despite these limitations, the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine allowed the empire to reorganize. While the West remained vulnerable to barbarian incursions, the East gradually strengthened, supported by a more diversified economy and a solid currency. The two emperors thus laid the foundations for a two-speed empire, whose destinies would eventually diverge over the following centuries. Upon Constantine's death in 337, the Roman Empire, already immense and complex to govern, was divided among his sons. This fragmentation of imperial power became a habit, with each emperor seeking to distribute his heritage among several heirs. But these successive partitions, supposed to ensure stability, only increased tensions and rivalries among the different branches of the imperial family. For several decades, the empire oscillated between reunification and division, depending on civil wars and shifting alliances. Finally, in 395, upon the death of Emperor Theodosius I, the separation became irreversible. The empire was officially divided into two distinct entities. In the east, Arcadius took control of the eastern provinces, with Constantinople as the capital. In the west, Honorius inherited the western provinces, administered from Milan, then Ravenna. What was once a temporary organization now became a lasting reality. The two halves of the empire began to follow increasingly independent trajectories. As time passed, disparities widened between the East and the West. The large eastern provinces, such as Syria, Egypt, or Asia Minor, maintained strong agricultural and commercial potential. Caravans crossing these regions brought back spices, silks, and other precious goods, spurring intense maritime traffic in the eastern Mediterranean. The Hellenized cities of Antioch, Alexandria, or Ephesus maintained a high level of urbanization, with intact infrastructure and a vibrant cultural life. In contrast, the West suffered from recurring economic difficulties. Italy, though the cradle of the empire, no longer had the same splendor as in the past. Major works became scarce, and the urban workforce diminished. The lands of Gaul, Spain, or North Africa remained productive, but their exploitation suffered from troubles related to invasions and political reconfigurations. In some regions, the regular supply of cities was disrupted, causing artisans and merchants to flee. Moreover, the Germanic pressure was felt more on the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Better financially equipped, the Eastern emperors could focus their efforts on defending their own borders, while the Western court struggled to mobilize the necessary resources. Military responsibilities were often entrusted to generals of barbarian origin, whose loyalty largely depended on their ability to obtain new lands or subsidies for their troops. In this context, Constantinople, today Istanbul, gradually strengthened its status as a political gravity center to the detriment of Rome, which lost symbolic authority. One of the major developments at the end of antiquity is undoubtedly the entrance of Germanic or Gothic peoples into the Roman world. From the end of the 4th century, the empire suffered assaults from populations driven by their own migration dynamics or by the pressure of other peoples upstream. The most striking example is that of the Visigoths. Having already confronted the Romans, they clashed with Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople in the year 378. Against all odds, the Roman army suffered a severe defeat there. Valens himself was killed, revealing the flaws in Roman military strategy. Subsequently, the Visigoths obtained a status of foederati from the empire. They were allowed to settle on Roman lands, supposedly in exchange for their military support. This practice became widespread. Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, and even Suebi made similar agreements, theoretically intended to strengthen the imperial army by adding more combatants. In reality, these massive settlements eroded Roman authority. Each federated people retained their own leaders, their own laws, and often acted as an independent regional power. Financially, the West was severely tested. The lands granted to the Germans no longer brought in taxes to the imperial administration. Moreover, The state often had to pay subsidies, in monetary form or in kind, to ensure the fidelity of these new allies. This drain exacerbated the tax pressure on the provinces still under the direct control of the emperor. Many landowners, subjected to increasing taxes, preferred to make direct agreements with neighboring barbarian chiefs, hoping to benefit from their protection against pillaging. Such local alliances reinforced the progressive fragmentation of public power. In a landscape where authority was disintegrating, currency played a revealing role in economic vitality. In the East, the gold solidus established the previous century continued to circulate massively. This coin, guaranteeing a certain purchasing power, ensured the stability of transactions in Byzantium and the eastern provinces. The West, on the contrary, lacked precious metals. The minting of gold coins became rare there, and the state had to resort to bronze or billon coins, an ignoble alloy, often depreciated. This depreciation not only affected commercial exchanges, it also impacted the overall confidence in the imperial administration's ability to fulfill its commitments. Farmers sometimes preferred to resort to barter. They exchanged wheat, wine, or oil for other essential goods. Long-distance transactions decreased because merchants hesitated to accept a currency whose value was questionable. The trade routes, already less safe due to barbarian incursions, lost part of their traffic. Lacking funds, the Western Roman state struggled to properly pay its officials and soldiers. The legionnaires, dissatisfied, could then resort to pillaging or be tempted to switch sides if a barbarian chief offered them better compensation. The tax collection networks became disorganized. Some tax collectors, to increase their own wealth, extorted taxpayers, while others vanished in the face of advancing enemy troops. In several regions, the imperial fiscal apparatus collapsed altogether, giving way to local arrangements dictated by force or negotiation. The heavy bureaucracy, patiently built over previous decades, therefore had to operate in an increasingly hostile environment. For reasons of prestige or to reinforce a control that was slipping away, the imperial court multiplied the positions. Each diocese, each prefecture, each office had officers responsible for ensuring compliance with the laws and the collection of taxes. But in reality, these complex procedures led to administrative delays and, above all, favored corruption. Some public offices were auctioned to the highest bidder, increasing nepotism within the administration. In a context of instability, officials sometimes sought to accumulate safe capital to flee to more stable provinces. Relations with the population deteriorated. Many inhabitants, especially among medium-sized landowners or merchants, believed that the state no longer ensured either security or prosperity. They had difficulty enduring the requisitions and taxes imposed by imperial representatives whose effectiveness was questionable. The break between the central power and the grassroots is reflected in a retreat to more protective local structures. The large landowners, later known as possessores or great lords, sometimes set up their own militias to protect their estates. Peasants, in search of security, place themselves under the protection of these notables, losing in freedom what they gain in safety. Despite numerous imperial laws, they become difficult to enforce in remote areas. Some barbarian generals settled in the West exercised quasi-sovereign power, further marginalizing the official government. Amidst this disintegration, Christianity gains momentum. From the beginning of the 4th century, the Church obtained legal status and growing support from the emperors. Roman elites, traditionally linked to the ancient civic religion, gradually turned towards the Christian faith. In the 5th century West, many dignitaries, senators, or local magistrates claimed this religion, which they view as a moral and spiritual benchmark while the imperial order crumbles. For the population, the church sometimes substitutes for the failings of the administration. It manages charitable works, shelters orphans, cares for the sick, and endeavors to maintain some social cohesion. Bishops become influential figures in their cities. Their role goes beyond the simple religious function. They arbitrate conflicts, sometimes negotiate with Germanic chiefs, threatening the city. In some cases, the bishop comes to replace the failing imperial authority, embodying a reassuring relay for the inhabitants. However, this rise of the church is not without tensions. Doctrinal disputes, between Arians and Nicenes for example, divide communities. Successive councils attempt to settle these theological controversies at the risk of causing schisms and rivalries. From a political viewpoint, the ecclesiastical hierarchy sometimes collects substantial revenues for its works, thus competing with the imperial treasury. In some regions, the church and the state enter into conflict for the control of resources and the population. In the West, the Bishop of Rome, gradually called the Pope, gains in notoriety. He benefits from the spiritual heritage of the historical capital of the empire, reinforced by the memory of the Apostle Peter, believed to have been the first Bishop of Rome. As the Western imperial authority fades, the papal figure gains importance, influencing diplomacy with the Germanic kings. In 410, Rome is taken and sacked by Alaric, the leader of the Visigoths. Never had the Eternal City, once at the heart of the empire, suffered such humiliation since the time of the Gauls in the 4th century before Christ. For the Romans, this sack has considerable resonance. More than the material losses, the psychological shock is immense. Rome, so long considered inviolable, has succumbed to invaders dubbed barbarians. This symbolic breach demonstrates that the Western Empire can no longer effectively assume its own defense. In the decades that follow, the imperial power weakens even more. Some Western emperors are no more than puppets manipulated by generals of barbarian origin. Stilicho, at first, tries for a time to protect Italy, but he is eventually sidelined. Later, Ricimer exercises real control behind the scenes, appointing and deposing emperors deemed too independent. Meanwhile, the Vandals capture North Africa between 429 and 439, cutting off Rome's access to one of its main breadbaskets. The loss of these fertile lands is compounded by a collapse of maritime control in the Western Mediterranean, as a Vandal fleet now asserts itself as the dominant force in these crucial waters for supplying Italy. With these invasions and territorial secessions, Roman authority disintegrates. The western provinces fall under the sway of Germanic kings who establish their own administration and levies. The empire's resistance evaporates in favor of increasingly autonomous local powers. Some senatorial aristocracies attempt to preserve fragments of the Roman order, but the already heavily eroded imperial centralization can no longer hold it all together. During this twilight 5th century, currency remains one of the thermometers of the empire's health. In theory, the gold coin, the solidus, continues to be minted and preserved in Constantinople. But the West is sorely lacking. Its reserves of precious metals have dried up, and trade routes have become unstable. Unable to maintain reliable coinage, the Western court finds itself unable to regularly pay the wages of regular troops. To compensate for this deficiency, the government relies more on federated troops, composed of Goths, Franks, or other peoples recently settled in Gaul, Italy, or Hispania. But this dependence increases the political and military power of these contingents, who can then negotiate their terms. In many cases, they eventually escape imperial control, and the empire is forced to recognize their sovereignty over certain provinces in exchange for a vaguely assured support. The fall in the value of bronze or bilong coins, containing little noble metal, and the absence of a stable currency lead to an overall shrinkage of the market economy. Without funding, the state can no longer maintain roads, bridges, and aqueducts, nor restore public buildings. Gradually, the commercial sphere dwindles, long-distance trade becomes sparse, and self-sufficiency strengthens in the countryside. Urban activity declines as small artisans, merchants, and the bureaucracy leave these unsafe or economically stricken centers. In 476, Romulus Augustulus, a young Western emperor practically unknown outside Italy, is deposed by the Germanic leader Odoacer. This event immediately takes on a symbolic value. For traditional Western history, it represents the official end of the Western Roman Empire. In reality, imperial power had already lost much of its influence for many years. Odoacer, proclaiming himself king of Italy, disregards the imperial figure and sends the insignia of power to Constantinople, acknowledging, with little sincerity, the honorary authority of the Eastern Emperor. This regime change is accompanied by a definitive shift of the senatorial elites toward the structures dominated by barbarian leaders. Senators, once at the heart of Roman governance, see their functions diluted. They can certainly retain lands and high social status, but their political role diminishes significantly. The Senate of Rome itself, once so prestigious, is now only an assembly with local influence. In parallel, the central administration in the West effectively disappears. The prefects of the praetorian, governors, and civil magistracies give way to new local authorities, a mix of Roman institutions and Germanic customs. Identities are recomposed. Rome ceases to reign definitively, and even the idea of a unified empire is limited to the East. In the wake of the collapse of imperial power, barbarian kingdoms emerge. Visigoths in Hispania, present-day Spain, Franks in Gaul, present-day France, Ostrogoths in Italy, and Vandals in North Africa. Each of these kingdoms is organized around a king and a warrior nobility, while gradually accommodating elements of the Roman heritage. Tax structures, legal frameworks, and Latin culture do not disappear overnight. Rather, there is a gradual fusion. Some Germanic chiefs understand the advantage of adopting Roman administrative practices to tax and manage local populations. Mixed marriages between Roman and barbaric elites also favor integration. Latin culture, carried by the Church, remains alive. Religious services, the drafting of laws, sometimes in Latin, and learning in monasteries help preserve a Roman foundation in the emerging civilization of the early Middle Ages. Cities, though often depopulated, mostly continue to exist, with municipal institutions inspired by the imperial era. Furthermore, the Church becomes a pole of stability and continuity. It recovers libraries, establishes episcopal schools, and copies ancient texts. In monasteries, scholarly life is maintained, allowing the transmission of Roman memory through the centuries. While the West is fragmenting, the Eastern Roman Empire continues on its path under the leadership of emperors settled in Constantinople. Richer, more densely populated, this part of the empire maintains a centralized administration inherited from the tetrarchic reforms. Its capital stands as a true fortress on the Bosporus, protected by imposing walls and endowed with a powerful naval base. On the monetary front, the East preserves the gold solidus, which ensures the fluidity of commercial exchanges. Numerous maritime routes connect Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor to Constantinople, favoring economic growth. Furthermore, the state apparatus remains relatively stable. The emperors, still claiming Rome, adapt the institutions to face Persian threats or incursions from the north. However, a cultural and religious divide is gradually widening between the Latinized West and the Hellenized East. Doctrinal divergences, particularly concerning the nature of Christ, lead to tensions between the Western Church, closer to Rome, and the Eastern Church. A future rivalry begins to take shape, which will culminate much later in the schism between Western Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Nonetheless, for several centuries after the fall of the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire claims the Roman heritage, to the point of considering itself as the only legitimate representative of the Imperium Romanum. Its monetary strength, sophisticated diplomacy, and strong population constitute assets that will allow it to survive until 1453, the year of the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is thus a multifaceted process. Invasions, economic crises, inflation, political instability, social mutations, and increasing divergences between two halves of a once unified whole. The year 476 mainly serves as a convenient landmark for historians because it symbolizes the disappearance of a full-fledged Western emperor. But the transformation was gradual, spread over several generations. The Roman legacy did not disappear. It continues through law, language, the church, and of course, the Eastern Empire, which lasts nearly another millennium in Byzantine form. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is thus not the end of all civilization, but the entry into a new era, the early Middle Ages, where composite kingdoms emerge, marrying Roman traditions and Germanic contributions. Institutions, mentalities, and commercial networks reorganize around new balances, while Constantinople remains, for a time, the beacon of the surviving Roman world. The history of this long transition highlights the complexity of the economic, political, and cultural factors that can lead an empire to decompose before being reborn in other forms.